Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. So, before we get into today's episode, a couple of quick updates on what's going on with the show and what's coming out next. So, last week I tried something a little bit different, and by audience selection I did an editorial episode on the history of libertarianism, or I should say, I guess, the first part of an editorial series on that, because once I got into it I realised I had more than an episode's worth of stuff to say on it. And I've really enjoyed doing that. And I asked for feedback. I said, do people want me to do more stuff like that, or should I just stick with interviews? And so far, the feedback's been completely positive. Everyone's said that they liked it, and the viewing numbers were good, and the completion rate, so that, like, the percentage of people who started the episode who then got through to the end is actually pretty strong for that. And then I got some more feedback, this time from Facebook, where people said, you were, like, talking about maybe spreading these out. Don't. Just do one long episode, or, like, do them back to back. I don't want to do one long episode. I don't want to, like, as much as I like something like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, which can go on for, like, 4 hours or something, I don't think we're there yet. I want to keep this show consistent to about an hour max per episode, ideally about 50 minutes, so that someone new to it can sort of get involved. But I'll keep the episodes close together. So I'm going to do this week's episode, and then its sequel. It's a 2-part on Wittgenstein, and then I'll do the rest of the episodes in the Libertarian series, and then we'll get back to interviews, but I'll do the rest of the series in one block after this interview. But this interview actually fits in really, really, really well. So well, in fact, that I'm tempted to say I planned it that way all along, but I absolutely didn't, but it really works out that way. So in the first part of my libertarianism series, you know what word I'm going for there, libertarianism, there we go, I can say the words of the things I'm supposedly talking to you about. In the first part, I argued that competition over the control of language is essential to understanding what political ideologies are, and I sort of waved my hand at a sort of Wittgensteinian ordinary language philosophy. In this series, with Dr. Rupert Read, who is a Green Party politician and a Wittgenstein scholar, we go into what that really means, and we try to build from the ground up so that people who aren't familiar with this branch and this style of philosophy can get a taste for it and can understand what people mean when they wave their hand and say, quote, in a Wittgensteinian way. So this series, it's going to be 2 parts, this week and next week, will be concerned with the philosophy of language, of word meaning, and then in the second part will relate how language and word meaning impacts the use of political power. Having just listened to this back in edit, I'm really happy with this series. I think this first part that you're about to listen to is a really good 101 exposition of who is Wittgenstein, what is the sort of use value of his philosophy, and what does he have to offer us. So I hope you're as excited for this one as I am. My guest for this episode is Dr. Rupert Read, who will be familiar to long-time listeners of the podcast. He was on Season 1. Dr. Read is at the University of East Anglia, specialising in philosophy of language, philosophy of science, and environmental philosophy. He's the author of a number of works and the editor of a number of collections, including, as we discuss in this episode, The New Wittgenstein. And as you'll hear, he's been influential in challenging some of the old ways of thinking about Wittgenstein and putting forward a new, more contiguous notion of Wittgenstein's life's work. Dr. Read is also very active as an environmental campaigner. He chairs the think tank Greenhouse UK, and he's active in the UK Green Party and is a strong environmental campaigner. He was elected as a city councillor for the Green Party, and he stood in the Norwich North by-election in 2009 as the Green Party candidate for Parliament. and returned the biggest by-election vote share in Green Party history with 9.7% of the vote. He's very active on Twitter, you can follow him there, and recently he gained quite a lot of attention when one of his tweets went viral. He tweeted that he'd been asked to do a debate with a climate change denier, and even though he would be very grateful for the exposure, he refused because he thought it's about time we ended this false equivalence between the evidence for climate change and the denials of it. And that got tens of thousands of retweets and likes and whatever, so that was pretty cool. And anyway, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Read back to the show. Like I say, I'm pretty happy with this as an introductory exposition to some philosophy that I personally have found really, really valuable. So yeah, without any further preamble, it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce or reintroduce Dr. Rupert Read. I'm joined today by Dr. Rupert Read. Rupert, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
So you were on season 1. I think it was the 4th or the 5th episode you were on. You were actually, by the way, the podcast's very first Twitter follower. I don't know if you knew that, but there you go. But for people who haven't checked out that episode, do you want to introduce yourself? I guess both as an academic and some of your other stuff?
Yes, so I teach philosophy at the University of East Anglia. I'm a reader in philosophy there. I've been at UEA a long time. I helped make UEA into a place that specialises in Wittgenstein's philosophy. So that's a real focus of ours and very much a focus of mine. That's been my main central philosophical interest, really, my entire career. So one of the things I'm best known for is having edited a book called The New Wittgenstein, which produced a radically new understanding of Wittgenstein's philosophy, and drew that together. I'm also interested and have become increasingly interested in recent years in political philosophy and environmental philosophy. And so part of what I do is to sort of apply Wittgenstein's philosophy in those fields. And I try to reach beyond the academic world. I chair a think tank called Greenhouse, and I'm also someone who tries to be active as a public intellectual and as a politician.
Cool. And you're a councillor, right, for the Green Party?
I used to be a councillor for the Green Party, yeah, for 2 terms, but not anymore. I'm a bit more focused now on the philosophy and publishing, and on seeking to get impact for my work through other channels via grants, via lobbying government, and being commissioned to write reports, that sort of thing.
Cool, great. So let's start at Wittgenstein, and then maybe at the end we'll have gotten back to that. So here's my motivation for wanting to do this episode. I listen to a lot of philosophy podcasts, and I am guilty of this myself. I often hear people say something, 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 quote, in a Wittgensteinian sort of way. And often probably the audience, if they don't, haven't done these philosophy courses, is left sort of wondering what in a Wittgensteinian sort of way. And sometimes I'm tempted to think that even the person who said that probably could use catching up in a Wittgensteinian sort of way, what that might mean. So let's start at the beginning. Biographically, I actually don't know anything about Wittgenstein biographically. Is there anything interesting we can say about him as a person to get us started?
Oh, he had an absolutely extraordinary life. And his philosophy, some would argue, is tied in with his life. I think, by the way, that you're right, that a lot of people who take Wittgenstein's name do take it rather in vain. It can be very frustrating to us Wittgenstein scholars. So I think it's a good idea to have this podcast episode so we can try to get a few things straight. In terms of Wittgenstein's life, the definitive biography, which is not perfect, but is very, very good, is Ray Monk's Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius. And Monk covers the whole thing in terms of, for example, Wittgenstein being born into a extremely rich family in Austria, one of 8 siblings, at least 2 and probably 3 of whom committed suicide, which Wittgenstein himself also seriously considered. He took an active part in the First World War on the Austrian side, and that had a huge impact on him in terms of waking him up really to God and ethics and the soul. After the war, he renounced his fortune, went again to England, but this time much less close to philosophers like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, who had been his teachers before. He very much forged his own way. And became really, in many ways, the center of the philosophical world, even though he published virtually nothing at all in his lifetime, apart from the early masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. During the Second World War, he was on the English side, the Allied side, and I've argued that actually you can read some of Wittgenstein's later philosophy as a kind of philosophy of pain and suffering and of antipathy to racism and anti-Semitism and so forth, i.e. the diseases of that time, the diseases of the intellect of that time. And Wittgenstein died tragically early at 62 of prostate cancer, which he wouldn't have died of it if he'd been alive now. And his final remark, which many have thought very surprising, given the extreme difficulties of much of his life, was, "Tell them I had a wonderful life."
That's interesting. So wait, his later stuff, the stuff that the philosophical investigations, the language stuff, is that posthumous? Is that released after his death?
Yeah, all
then?
published posthumously. Yeah,
I actually didn't know that, because that's what people are referencing when they say in a Wittgensteinian way, to sort of loosely mean that like language is a shared good and words have different meanings and stuff like that. They're sort of waving a hand in that direction, right?
Yeah. But all of that comes from posthumous work, the most crucial of which is the so-called philosophical investigations, a lot of which he worked on very, very, very hard, but never quite in such a way as to be finally satisfied with it. But it's in a good order, more than some of the other later work.
I feel like I'm going to regret this question in advance because I'll just be revealing my own ignorance. But the narrative of his intellectual development. Okay, I'll give the narrative and you pick holes in it. But the narrative is, you get the Logicus Tracticus, which is, I bought it once just to sort of see it, but good luck to anyone who can get through it. That's sort of a work of formal logic. But the narrative of the intellectual development goes something like, when he was young, he was a naive who believed that words have exact meanings, and that what's the quote, what can be said exactly, and anything else isn't really worth saying. And then as he matured, he realised obviously words are defined by their relationship with other words, that words can mean many different things, and that language is a sort of communal good. And he ends his life with the sort of broad, ordinary language philosophy, that language is a sort of distributed ground-up phenomenon that people like, and people feel clever when they sort of wave their hand and say in a Wittgensteinian sort of way. So that's the narrative I was always sort of given of his intellectual development. I have a feeling you're going to want to pick holes in that a little, though.
Absolutely, because I think you've given a reasonably fair account of that narrative as it's often told. But the thing is, it's told that way a lot less often now. And I've had a role in that. I was, as I mentioned before, one of those who put together the new Wittgenstein collection, which brought together the scholars who, above all, wanted to overturn that narrative. And the kind of thing that we've been saying is that the narrative gets things wrong sort of from both ends and in the middle. Let me explain that. So the narrative suggests there were two distinct Wittgensteins, whereas we argue the new Wittgensteinians, or the resolute readers, as we're sometimes called, we argue that in a large extent, one can say that actually there was really one Wittgenstein throughout, that the discontinuity has been grossly exaggerated. There are changes. There are very, very important changes as Wittgenstein's career goes on. But there are changes sort of within the nature of a development and a sort of constructive critique. They're changes of the nature of a systemic improvement, but not of a outright repudiation in the way that it's usually taught. So, very roughly speaking, one Wittgenstein rather than two Wittgensteins. And also we argue that both of those two Wittgensteins, so-called, have been misunderstood. So you mentioned that the Tractatus is thought of as, in some ways, a work of formal logic. But the Tractatus also, from the beginning, was as well as that, was a sort of very poetic work, and crucially was a work that's in its very method, and that's the fundamental thing to understand about the Tractatus, as arguably with all of Wittgenstein's philosophy. It's method, not the conclusions he came to, not the theories he held to, because he didn't hold to any, but the methods which he thought philosophy should be pursued by way of. And in the Tractatus, the method is such that the alleged theories or theses that Wittgenstein was supposed to have held to in the Tractatus are already undermined, are already thrown away, to use the term he uses, by the end of that work. And what remains is only the method and a better sense of one's own vulnerability to temptation, to confusion, and therefore a better sense of, if you will, self-knowledge. And in that way, you could think of Wittgenstein from his early work onward as a kind of inheritor of Socrates. The remark that I think you were seeking to quote from the Tractatus, from the preface, runs, "What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." And there's a certain sense in which I would like to suggest that remains true in Wittgenstein's later work. And the later work, which is actually the main focus of we new Wittgensteinians, it's sometimes thought that we're obsessed with the Tractatus, but actually what we're really interested in is Wittgenstein's fully mature philosophy, which most of us consider the greatest philosophical work that there's ever been. We tend to suggest that the ways in which Wittgenstein's later philosophy is understood has also been it's also been severely traduced, because Wittgenstein is reduced to a series of supposed theories or theses, such as all language consists of language games, meaning equals use. There can't be any such thing as a private language. A private language is impossible. Language is necessarily something shared by people in a community or in a public space. And all of these kinds of ideas run the risk of being just new theses, new theories, new dogmas. And Wittgenstein's absolutely central concern throughout his life is the attempt to overcome and let go of any such dogmas.
Right, I remember reading a paper of yours, I'm blanking on it. It might have been the Wittgenstein versus rules that we did in our last one, where you say at every point Wittgenstein is wanting to say, do you really know that? What makes you so confident? At every single point, he's doing this, why do you think you know that? Are you really sure of that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that's right. But in a very different register from how a philosophical skeptic would do it. What he's wanting to put into doubt, if you will, is nothing in our ordinary or everyday lives, insofar as we escape from philosophy or ideology, but only rather the pictures by which we are possessed. But he does think that those pictures go way beyond philosophy narrowly considered as an academic discipline. He thinks that mathematicians are vulnerable to them. He thinks that psychologists are very vulnerable to them. He thinks, I've argued, that politicians and ideologues and so on are very vulnerable to them. So it's a critique, if you will, of language, and a critique of of culture, above all a critique of philosophy, but it doesn't have the same kind of destructive or certainly skeptical aim that has often been the case in the history of philosophy. Indeed, Wittgenstein provides a very powerful set of ways of overcoming, or at least reckoning with, the skeptical impulse. And he thinks it's a kind of typical philosophical mistake to think that skepticism shows that, we don't know that other people exist, that we don't have any knowledge or anything like that. He thinks that's all kind of philosophy gone too far, gone to town.
Right, he's not doing the how do you know that chairs are real thing that people do just for the sake of playing that game. But let's start with a bunch of the stuff you referenced. So there's a number, you mentioned word games, the other one would be like family resemblances, private language. I mean, maybe we can pick some of these off one by one, but let's just try and go back to, like, the framing of this in terms of, like, what words of advice would you offer to, I don't know, like a first-year philosophy student approaching this for the first time? Because I'm sure that, like, the ways we're invoking ideas like word games and private language and family resemblances are probably simplifications of the original ideas, and I'm sure you would want to point out maybe, in fact, we're getting it wrong, or at the very least it's more subtle than that. But nonetheless, I do find... I'm not a Wittgenstein scholar at all, so I'm sure the understandings I have in my head of these terms are dumbed down to a degree. But nonetheless, I do find them quite useful. You know what I mean? So how do you... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, they're tools. That's right. They're useful. They're tools. That what you mustn't do is get kind of obsessed with them or fixated on them. And Wittgenstein was very worried that that's what people would do.
I'm not going to call people out by name, but I can just see in my head a number of MA students who I've met who can't hear a sentence without deconstructing it linguistically with these tools. And it's like, yes, that's very clever, but also we need to convey meaning, even if you can be clever about how that meaning's conveyed. Sorry, that was an aside. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Wittgenstein was very worried that people would get obsessed with these tools. So Wittgenstein comments at the end of a wonderful late series of lectures, "The seed I'm most likely to sow is a certain jargon."
Which has happened, right?
Yeah, he exactly didn't want people to fixate upon these terms that he's made famous and turn them into something like technical terms or items in a theory, which can then be sort of ground out in a kind of mechanical way. Rather, what he was hoping to do was to stimulate people to think and to be able to look and see what is, to look and see how our language works, to look and see how our society works, rather than seeing it all by way of prejudices or predilections. So what I would say to somebody starting in philosophy maybe, or starting in Wittgenstein, is I would say philosophy is hard. And Wittgenstein is really very hard. If you don't feel some of that difficulty, then you're not getting it. There's a lovely story which I think illustrates some of this. So when Wittgenstein first came to England as a young man and studied with Russell, he went to some of More's lectures, and Russell said to More after one of these lectures, "So More, what do you think of our German?" Meaning Wittgenstein. And More said to Russell, "Well, I like him very much." And Russell said to More, "Oh yes, why is that?" And More said, "Well, he's the only one who looks puzzled in my lectures." And that's how one should look in philosophy lectures. One should look puzzled. And so I often say to my students, look, if you're not puzzled in the early stages of the semester, then you're not getting it. If you're not puzzled, then you're not getting it. And I think that Wittgenstein's philosophy, like More's philosophy, actually, can be deceptive. It can seem as though it's not that hard. Both More and the later Wittgenstein often write with a great interest in ordinary language, everyday life, etc. The sentences are often quite seemingly straightforward. It doesn't have the kind of gnomic appearance of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. But actually, there is a great difficulty, or a great set of difficulties lurking here. A good question to ask yourself in relation to Wittgenstein's later writing is, why is this being written? Why am I being told this? Because it can seem either incredibly kind of irrelevant or incredibly obvious. So try to kind of find the purpose of it. Try to find the point of it. Why would somebody say this kind of thing? One answer to that question, why, is quite often, by no means always, but quite often, that Wittgenstein is, as he sometimes puts it, trying to remind you of something. He's trying to remind you of something that you're inclined to forget. Perhaps because our society occludes it, for example, because our society is so obsessed with science and the methods of science, or perhaps because it's always staring you in the face. Wittgenstein says somewhere, look, some of the most difficult things to see are actually the most obvious things because they're always in front of you. So you miss them because of their familiarity. And Wittgenstein is sometimes trying to remind you of things that are incredibly familiar, but you need to be reminded of them in order to see them so that you don't miss them, so you don't, as it were, stare straight through them.
Okay, so that's... Okay, so there's something I want to say here, and you can tell me if you think I'm getting this wrong, where you do want to caution against going, I've read the family resemblances metaphor, now I understand, now I've, snapped my fingers, now I've got it. With that being said, I do think there is a sense where even the sort of simplified version of these tools, you want to be careful with them. You certainly always want to be careful to say you don't understand everything. Certainly, you don't want to always be bringing them up in a manner that's jargonistic. With that being said, I do feel like they sort of get you out of the gutter a bit.
Yes.
And, a lot of people, there's like a really simple set of intellectual ideas that they've heard and they've gone, now I suddenly get what's really happening in the world. And for a lot of people, even though I studied economics, this was never me. Once they really wrap their head around the basic supply-demand thing, they're like, oh my god, now everything else falls into place. For other people, it was like, the Marxist dialectic and like the demystification of objective reality and all of that. And for me, it was sort of getting out of... We all sort of think their words have a meaning and there is this thing that's tied to them separate to usage, and just sort of getting away from that a bit. And it wasn't all Wittgenstein. I've also been... my tutor at Oxford was Michael Friedan, who takes a very, very linguistic approach to political theory. And so I was very interested in that and his whole central thesis of political belief systems, one of their primary functions being competitions over an ever-fluid and ever-changing language meaning. Yes. And while I take all of your notes as to what we might say epistemic caution, I do think there is a thing where you can learn a lot of these linguistic tools, and if you approach them with an open mind, they don't get you into the clouds, but they do get you out of this sort of gutter, and they do just allow you to sometimes see very, very clearly what's going wrong in people's communication with each other all the time. So I don't know. Let me get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. So on the one hand, if I think back, for example, to the first time when I read Philosophical Investigations back in Oxford when I was studying with Anthony Kenny and Stephen Mulhall. I read the Philosophical Investigations. I wrote a load of notes on it. I had the opportunity a few years after that to look back on those notes, and I realized that they were now absolutely useless to me. That I had very, very little comprehension of the Investigations the first time I read it. But of course, even that experience had some use. It was a sort of dialectical step or something that I needed to pass through in order to get to a point of being able to use these ideas. And as you've implied, absolutely, these ideas are there to be used. They're not there to be worshipped. They're not there to be argued to be true or false. They're there to be used. And one that you mentioned is a very nice example of this is Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblances, which is a sort of displacement of, or a critique of, the traditional way in which in philosophy there's been a kind of very widespread assumption that can be traced back to Socrates and Plato, that what we're trying to do when we do philosophy in relation to words or concepts is to understand their essential meaning, their essence, and then we can project that into new cases. And the family resemblance idea of Wittgenstein's just kind of undermines that presupposition that there must be such an essential meaning. So Wittgenstein famously argues, look, does the word game, does the concept of game have an essence of that kind? Can it be meaningfully defined in terms of something like necessary and sufficient conditions? And he suggests that it can't. And that the consequences, therefore, if many of the most important terms to us in philosophy and beyond philosophy are actually, roughly speaking, family resemblance concepts rather than concepts that have an essence, well, then that does have quite significant consequences. And of course, one set of those consequences has been traced out in political theory with the work of people like William Connolly, Stephen Lukes, and other of my teachers at Oxford, Michael Friedan, who you mentioned. The concept, for example, of essentially contested concepts, the idea that many of our concepts in politics and morality, that it is, if they have an essence, the essence is that they're contested, not that the essence is easy to pin down. Examples being words like power or indeed politics itself. The concept of an essentially contested concept, without doubt, goes back to some extent initially to Wittgenstein's influence on philosophy back in the day.
Because that's so good, and I just want to spend the rest of this interview going through that line of argument and cashing out the key words there, because, like, if you were to draw a pie chart of, like, the things I've got from philosophy that have impacted me, like, a big chunk of that pie chart is going to be taken up by some of the terms you've just used. So family resemblance is essentially contestable concepts. And, So, Lukes as well. I mentioned Friedan. Lukes is someone who's always worth reading. But let's start with family resemblances, because you touched on it, but let's really go over this for people who are encountering it for the first time. So to start you off, he takes the word game and he says, well, what is a game? And, like, you know, it's a fair question, right? You don't exactly trip over them. And, you know, any idea that you might put to it, even as a necessary condition, much less a sufficient one, you'll find isn't true of all the times that we use the word game in, let's just say, contemporary English or American spoken English, right? So you might say games are competitive, right? Well, what about that scene from The Great Escape where he's famously just throwing the baseball against the wall? That's a game, but it's not competitive. You might say they involve physical activity, but, you know, I played Monopoly with my wife a few nights ago, and that doesn't seem particularly physically onerous. And whatever you bring forward, you'll find it'll be present in some uses of the word game, maybe even most uses of the word game, but it won't be present in all of them. And if there's no single thing that's present in all of them, then what are you left with in terms of meaning? And Wittgenstein says, well, hang on, you're assuming meaning is that there is a set of necessary conditions, and instead he uses the metaphor of a family resemblance. Do you want to take us through that side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a little quote from the Philosophical Investigations, section 66. It begins, consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? So that's the question. That's the traditional philosophical question. What is common to them all? But Wittgenstein is going to respond to that in a very oblique way. He's going to suggest that in a certain sense, there isn't anything that's common to them all. But he doesn't think that there results from that a skeptical conclusion. He thinks rather what results from that is that we get some kind of clarity on the way that the concept of game and similarly other concepts, such as, crucially, the concept of language, is what he's interested in, the concept of language itself. She doesn't have the kind, or doesn't necessarily have, the kind of nature that philosophers have assumed it has. So Wittgenstein goes on, don't say there must be something common, or they would not be called games. but look and see whether there is anything common to all. So this moment where he says, don't say there must be something common, is a crucial moment for me. This is where, as I see it nowadays, Wittgenstein is trying to liberate us. He's trying to free us. And this is almost a political aspect to his philosophy. He's trying to free us from assumptions that we're very subject to. He's trying to free us from the unaware grip of dogmas. And anytime there is an alleged must, a metaphysical must, if you will, anytime there's an alleged necessity, then Wittgenstein is suspicious. And in that way, he's highly suspicious of the traditional philosophical enterprise. He goes on, if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look, which is, of course, a remarkable thing for a philosopher to say. What philosophers are endlessly telling each other to do is just think more. And that's what we do. That's what philosophy is, thinking. And Wittgenstein says, well, take a step back. Consider the possibility that your thoughts are actually constrained by pictures that are holding you captive. And again, here's the metaphor of liberation very famously in his thought. And that overthinking itself could be a disease. Try to find a way where it's possible for you to actually see, rather, how our language actually works. And what Wittgenstein suggests, if we actually look at the great diversity of games that you mentioned before, is that, quote, we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. And then he says, in a famous moment, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say, games form a family. And in the same way, he will say, language forms a family, if you will, of what he calls language games.
So this is where I'm going to reference what I just said earlier, is I take all of your cautionary notes on board, but with that said, once you just let that idea loose in your mind, and you let it loose on everything else, including moral and political concepts, that is just an astoundingly useful bit of software to have running in your brain. Just that one bit, you know?
Yeah,
and it's accessible to anyone, you know? That's not...
Yes.
You don't need to be particularly clever to get that.
Well, that's right. There is a sense in which much of what Wittgenstein has to offer, and I would argue this is true actually once you start to understand it, even of the early philosophy, there is a sense in which what he's offering is very simple. It doesn't require cleverness. What it requires, which is much more difficult than cleverness, is, well, you could call it wisdom, which philosophers are always seeking, or you could call it the willingness to actually look, to set aside your prejudices, to set aside the assumptions with which you are comfortable. So there is a very important moment in Wittgenstein's later work where he says, look, the real difficulty in philosophy is not a difficulty of the intellect. People think that philosophy is about being really clever, being really intellectually smart. But Wittgenstein says that's not the difficult part of philosophy. The difficult part of philosophy is a matter of will. And he says, I want to try to get you to do something that you don't want to do. I want to break your habits of thinking that you have to look at things in such and such a way, being constrained unawarely by thoughts, by ideologies, by prejudices. That's what philosophy is really all about for Wittgenstein. So this might sound like a bizarre lateral move, but I'm going to bring it back in. I just had a really good conversation with Philip Pettit, and we used the analogy of money, and bear with me for a minute here, in that a lot of people feel that there must be some sort of intrinsic value to money, right? That, like... And they get leery about, like, fiat currencies for that reason, right? It's in big quotes, not real. But then you can tell a very simple story where you sort of say, imagine a barter economy in which there is no money, and you produce corn and I produce
wicker furniture, and you want to get some of my wicker furniture, but I don't want any of your corn. Well, the solution would be we'd all just sort of agree at the end of the day that there's one good we're all happy to hold. It might be gold, but in other economies it might be another precious metal. Apparently in prisons it's cigarettes, this sort of thing. And once you tell that story, you get to the point where you say there's actually nothing about the gold. It's just a collective agreement we all have on the basis of it. But now the problem there with telling that story to people isn't any sort of intellectual cleverness required to understand it. The problem is we have this hardwired instinct that there's some property of the gold that's giving it its value. There's some property of the banknote that's giving it its value. And we have an instinct when it comes to moral terms, what is right, what is just, what is whatever, that there's some property of that word that goes beyond just our shared understanding of what that word is. And there goes to even something like game. There's just this prejudice that it must track to something. It can't just be this Venn diagram where there's no point in the middle of the Venn diagram where you can put a pin. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the real challenge comes in getting people to just step, even for a moment, outside of those prejudicial commitments. And again, you're right, it's not cleverness, and you don't need jargon for it. It's more just a sort of like flexibility is maybe the wrong word, an openness
Yes,
to stand somewhere else.
Yes.
And like the money one actually really bugs me as someone who was made to endure economics, is that there's no intrinsic worth to any sort of money, including something very tangible like gold. It's just consent. That's it. Locke had it right, And I think that is the value you get from Wittgenstein, is just like how liberating it can be to step outside of these things. I talked for a bit. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. So money is trust, we might say.
Yes.
Right? Money is trust. And I think that's an eminently Wittgensteinian thought. And indeed, I've done Wittgensteinian philosophy of money myself. I've published on it. And as
I didn't know that. That was just my last conversation coming in.
It just makes total sense to me. All these things fit together. Having a kind of we don't have to get obsessed all with looking for the object, which is allegedly the referent of a word, and instead focusing on the actual richness of use as something that we do. That's the Wittgensteinian way here. And let me give a quotation again from Philosophical Investigations, which illustrates this very nicely, I think. So Wittgenstein is here seeking to engage, as it were, with somebody who thinks that meaning must be a matter of the object for which a word stands, rather than anything like the use to which we put words. So this is the end of Philosophical Investigations, section 120. Wittgenstein writes, "You say the point isn't the word, but its meaning, and you think of the meaning as a thing of the same kind as the word, though also different from the word. Here the word, there the meaning. The money and the cow that you can buy with it. But contrast," Wittgenstein says, "money and its use." So as it were, Wittgenstein is saying there, look, if you want to get a clear picture of how linguistic meaning works, of how linguistic meaning is a matter of use, rather than a matter of the objects for which words allegedly stand, like in a dictionary or something, then actually the analogy of money is one that could actually help you. Because if you focus on the way that actually, if you will, money is its use, money lives in its use. If you've got a pile of notes standing there, well, they're nothing. They're just pieces of paper. Where they actually have their power is where they get used on the basis of a fundamental trust or a fundamental institution. So The money and the cow that you can buy with it, that's kind of like thinking that you've got a word and then the object which it stands for. But contrast, Wittgenstein says, money and its use. Now you start to get a picture of the way he envisages language and meaning as being very closely tied in with its use. And you see the way that you can kind of flip this either way, this kind of analogy between money and meaning.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. Coming up next week, we'll conclude this series with Dr. Rupert Read on Wittgenstein. So in the first part, we talked about Wittgenstein, his life, and his approach to the philosophy of language. In the next part, we're going to ask what all of that means. What does it mean when we start applying this approach to language and to word meaning, to words like freedom and justice and power, and even politics itself? And we end up discussing, almost debating actually, whether it's possible to ever truly escape the political, to escape politics, to carve out spaces for ourselves that are not impacted by power and political considerations. And that turns out to be a really interesting back and forth, so I hope you'll come back and join us for that. Then the week after, as I said, I'll get back to the libertarianism series, and for those of you who haven't checked it out, I encourage you to go and check out the first part that I did, which is just called Libertarianism, an Ideological History. And so what I'm attempting to do there is, I think there's a lot of content on podcasts or blogs or whatever about whether liberalism or libertarianism or socialism is right or wrong. I don't think there's as much good stuff as to what they are in the first place. What are the material circumstances that led to their creation? How do we understand the essential function of political belief systems? What do they do, in other words? Particularly for the modern era. So if you asked me for good resources on history of political thought, I could provide you with a lot of stuff, but on the formation of modern ideologies like liberalism, socialism, libertarianism, I don't know, there's less stuff, so maybe that's more of a niche to fill. So I'm going to be getting back to that episode. In the first part of the series, we covered the origins of libertarianism in figures like Herbert Spencer in the late 1800s, reacting as they were to both material circumstances like the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, but also to ideologies such as progressive liberalism that they felt had gotten away from the quote-unquote real liberalism. In the next part, I'm going to track the development of that ideology through the turn of the century, how it interacted with ideas like the market, like the field of economics, and more controversially, I'm going to argue that both that and progressive liberalism were hugely impacted by popular awareness of the theory of evolution. So, that's what's coming out over the next few weeks. I hope you'll stay tuned. As always, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, so you can subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud. If you have a podcast playing app on your phone, you can pretty much always find us on those. Castbox, I've been using, Podcast Catcher, there's a whole bunch of them. And as always, just quickly finally, big thank you to everyone who signed up to sponsor us on Patreon. This show has no corporate sponsors, and we do not do advertisements, because advertisements are icky. They spoil long-form podcast conversations. They make them worse, and they undermine their credibility. So, my commitment to you is never to do ads on the show, so the show is entirely made possible by people chipping in whatever they can. If you have a couple of bucks spare, we would love to have them to keep this podcast going, so check out patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast to donate any amount. And you can also check out our website, which is just politicalphilosophypodcast.com, or if you just Google Political Philosophy Podcast or my name, it's the first thing that comes up. So, thank you again for listening. I'm really excited for what we've got coming out over the next few weeks. The second part, I thought this was a good episode, I hope you'll agree. And then the second part really takes it to the next level. So I hope you'll come back for that. And I'm also childishly excited to get back to the ideological history series that I've been doing. So if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope you'll return. So yeah, thanks again for listening. Hope you'll come back then.